Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Daily Express's Royal Roundup. This is the show where we digest and go over all of the royal stories which have been happening this week. Now, if you looked at the papers, the royal finances have been under spotlight today, with lots of people questioning different choices. So some people saying the cost of living has even affected the king. Well, it's obviously a topic which has been spoken about a lot recently, as it's been affecting everybody more than others. Well, to go over all of this, we are joined by Daily Express's royal correspondent, Richard Palmer. Richard, lots to go over today, but we'll try and keep it as simple as possible, because this is one of the topics which, when I get you onto one of these topics, it could go bigger and bigger and bigger. So we'll just focus, if we can, to try and keeping it to a sense of comparison in terms of what we know. Richard, how has it been looking? Because apparently the headlines are saying that the cost of living has affected the king, which, from my perspective, is quite difficult to actually understand, because this is one of the richest men in Britain, obviously so much influence, has got lots and lots of money in his pocket from various things going on within the family. Talk to me about that then. How's the cost of living affected the king?
Yeah, it's affected. I suppose. Yes, first thing to say is that when I mentioned to a colleague last night that we were doing about how the cost of living crisis was affecting the royal family, this colleague sort of said, "Oh yeah, poor things," sort of sarcastically.
Yeah.
Yes, they are pretty wealthy, and I suppose this is about how the cost of living crisis is affecting the business, the firm. The business side of the royal family, and we can come on to, for example, William has just inherited a £24 million a year fortune, so we shouldn't feel too sorry for them. But if you're running any sort of commercial operation, for want of a better word, or in this case, business of the monarchy incorporated, rising gas, electricity, other utility bills, the effect on your staff, having to pay higher wages to staff to allow them to keep afloat themselves. It's going to have an effect on the coffers, and it's clear that it's been quite a tough year for the royal household in that sense, and they've had to dip into their reserves, and those reserves have been built up over a little while, mainly because pretty generous settlement by the government over the past few years has allowed them to build up those reserves, and they've been storing up money to spend on refurbishing Buckingham Palace. And I think because of the cost of labour, the cost of living, whatever, they've had to shelve some projects, delay some of the resurfacing work at Buckingham Palace, had to turn the heating down in the palaces. I think that's partly the king's doing. I mean, anybody who's visited Clarence House over the last few years will know that it's often quite cold and drafty, and he really doesn't like being in warm rooms, and he doesn't like spending the money. But I think probably most importantly, he wants to cut carbon emissions, because of the effects on the planet.
Yeah, of course. And I mean, these houses aren't small, put it that way. But I guess going back to what I said at the beginning in terms of cost of living, you say, they've been building up these reserves. Well, how big are these reserves when it comes down to millionaires? Do you keep a couple of million there? Do you keep thousands? I mean, how big is this?
Well, no, they have been in the tens of millions, and in fact, they got to one point where they had exceeded. There are so many complicated rules, and I won't get bogged down in detail, not least because I can't remember all the figures off the top of my head. But there are complicated rules set by the government that say if they build up too big a reserve, then they're supposed to pay some of it back. But they were given, if I remember rightly, about 2 or 3 years ago, they were given special dispensation to hold on to a bigger pile of money that they hadn't spent, because this £369 million building project at Buckingham Palace was what they were saving the money for, and it was just they hadn't got to the stage where they needed to spend all of the dosh at that point.
And in terms of this affecting staff who work for the royal family evidently have different bank accounts to those who are within the royal family, and they are on a salary. Now, did the cost of living, will this affect staff there in terms of their paychecks or what it's like to work there?
Yeah, and the palace has tried to help people. I think the royal household has paid out two special payments, one in the autumn, one in the spring, to help people get through the sort of high inflation here. And inflation's been around about 10%, 10.1% for much of the last year. I mean, I have to say their pay rises haven't kept up with inflation still. I mean, in general, they've the royal household has given people between 5-6% pay rise. But that's not too bad in the current climate. I can think of other organisations that are seeking to pay less than that to their staff.
Yes, indeed.
But one of the things that has happened, which I found quite interesting, is that they've had to cut the budget for property maintenance elsewhere. So there's one thing which is this giving the complete facelift to Buckingham Palace, but then you've got all the other residences, Kensington Palace, Clarence House, St James's Palace, Windsor Castle, etc., which are all, in one way or another, funded by the taxpayer and maintained at the taxpayer's expense. And they've had to cut the budget for by 10%, which has meant, one example I highlighted, I think I might have mentioned this a few weeks ago on here. 4 years ago, the Duke and Duchess of Gloucester moved out of the apartment next door to William and Kate's at Kensington Palace. Princess Margaret's old apartments there, which were it was a huge apartment, and it was effectively split in two. One 21-room apartment is now occupied by William and Kate, although they don't spend much time there at all these days because they've moved out to Windsor. And the other was the Duke and Duchess of Gloucester's 21-room apartment. They downsized. That building had been eyed up as a possible home for Harry and Meghan 4 or 5 years ago. But it needed a lot of work doing on it. It got quite a lot of dangerous asbestos that needed removing. It's been empty ever since. They've got rid of the asbestos, but they haven't got the money to actually do it up to the standards to make it habitable again.
Yeah, I mean, this does bring round the conversation of, okay, fine, they don't have the money to redo things right now, but surely they have so many homes which they would be able to offer to, which we'll bring on to another topic in a minute. Pippa says plenty of room for refugees.
Yes.
We'll be speaking about the new campaign by Prince William, Homewards, which is about homelessness, but surely they have so many different rooms that they could offer to the royal family and who's involved in it. They don't necessarily need to do up all these rooms. I mean, is there really justification in the current climate with the cost of living to redo any of this?
Well, I think it is embarrassing. It's a difficult sell for the royal family at the moment. Yeah. That they've got so many different homes, and did you say we can come on to William's campaign, homelessness campaign, but yeah, I mean I've written before and we talked here before about the number of homes that the King and Queen Camilla have got access to. The Prince and Princess of Wales have got 3 homes. and there is a growing list of empty properties on the royal estates. So, one we were going to come on to, I suspect, is Frogmore Cottage. I don't know if you want me to mention that now or come back.
I mean, you know what? Let's move on to Frogmore Cottage, which is Harry and Meghan. We've been speaking about them a lot. They're not senior members of the working royal family anymore, but they are obviously attached to the royal family. Well, they, of course, had Frogmore Cottage at their disposal, but that has now come to an end. It's official. It's done. Yes. They don't have an official residence here in the UK anymore. However, saying that, I'm sure if they did come back, I'm sure the king would be very happy to put them up in one of his many rooms and residences if needed.
Yeah, I think you're right. And it was useful to have that final on the record confirmation that they have vacated that property, because for the past few weeks there's been a lot of reporting about Frogmore Cottage because of the suggestion that the king wants Prince Andrew to move in there, and palace officials have been very reluctant to talk about it. And I think part of the reason is the sensitivity over the Sussexes. You know, they don't want to be accused of briefing against the Sussexes or whatever, and so they've just not wanted to touch it with a barge pole. Do you
think that they give the Sussexes special treatment because of the public falling out between all of the different members of the royal family and the Sussexes, that whatever is briefed to journalists such as yourself, Richard, is very much tight-lipped and very to the point because they don't want anything misconstrued here?
Yeah, I think they're being extremely wary. I mean, I think they, when people who are authorised to speak to the press on behalf of members of the royal family do talk to journalists, I think they often reflect the differing attitudes and approaches of the principals they're representing, the individuals they're representing. And so some people will have, a much different interpretation of what they think the public should know about them than others do. So, for example, when Prince William got COVID, he didn't want anybody to know. He thought, he's, I think, since argued that he didn't want to frighten the nation because his father had got COVID around about the same time Prime Minister had got COVID, but for whatever reason, he didn't want that discussed. And some of us did ask about that around about that time or afterwards, and got very short shrift. Whereas when the then Prince of Wales, Prince Charles, got COVID, his advisors knew that they're just different type of people. They've got a wide circle of friends, he and Camilla, and they just knew it would get out pretty quickly because they just talked to so many different people. So from their point of view, I think they felt we need to make an announcement about this as soon as possible, just to get it out there, get it on the record. And
so they're quite choosy about what they release and what they don't release.
Forgive me, I might have mentioned this before. I think I have mentioned this before. But, classic case is Princess Anne when she became a grandmother for the first time. I think it was the first time. We were asking what's the baby called, and nobody at the palace could get her to respond, as far as I could tell. In the end, it was about 2-3 weeks later. She was at church in the Sandringham area with the Queen. And a member of the public just asked her, and she told her, but her own staff didn't seem to be able to get the answer out of her, or perhaps didn't start to ask.
Funny. That shows how siblings can be very, very different, I suppose.
Yeah.
Okay, fine. So I guess now Harry and Meghan officially done with Frogmore Cottage. End of an era, Richard?
Yes, I suppose so. But he raises another question. Well, who's going to move in there? And the palace just doesn't want to talk about that, other than to say that no decision has been made.
No.
So, it's still my understanding that the king is. It's not so much that he's not threatening to evict Andrew because he doesn't have the power to do that. It's the Crown Estate, which he really has nothing to do with directly, that owns the lease on that property. But I think from what I can understand, he worries about whether Andrew can afford to stay there. Andrew is determined to stay there. So what happens to Frogmore Cottage is going to be one that people are going to be watching for over the next year, I think.
Within the royal finances, which got released today, was there any indication as to whether the late Queen, she evidently left a lot of her estate behind, but is there anything in terms of actual monetary finances which has been released?
No, because that would have been a personal thing. There's always a distinction made between what is the money that comes from the taxpayer that they feel they have to account for, and then money that comes via the Duchy of Lancaster estate into what they call the privy purse, and other forms of private income for.
Yeah, I was going to. Is this all UK based? Because obviously very different. But when you think about the government, there have been other scandals across the years where there have been overseas accounts and stuff, which tax avoidance within the UK, and been putting money in there. There's nothing like that has come up or anything.
Well, there has in the past. Sloan saying possibility of Royal Lodge and Frogmore as multiple family dwellings. Come back to that perhaps, but there has been some evidence of that in the past. I think it was the Paradise Papers.
Yes.
There were leaks of famous people's financial information, and it transpired that some members of the royal family had been investing overseas in tax havens. So there was some things about that. But this is about then accounting for the sovereign grant, the taxpayer funding, and so they make the distinction. So one of the stories that's in our paper this morning, I don't think it actually has gone online, is that the late Queen's former private secretary, Sir Edward, well, now Lord Young of Old Windsor, was Sir Edward Young, got a payout of between £145,000 and £150,000 when he left in May. But somebody else, there were 16 payoffs, people made redundant or had exit packages. But on top of that, there would have been others who were personally employed by the late Queen, who were let go or volunteered for redundancy after her death, and those don't appear in the public accounts. And then you've got some, and the good case here is Angela Kelly, who was the Queen's personal assistant and dresser, dress designer. She had a formal role, an official role, and was paid by the taxpayer for that. But then part of her role was also deemed to be personal, and she was paid personally by the Queen.
Interesting. So, and I guess, the Queen was performing, in very much in the public eye. So whose discretion is down to whether it gets paid out the public money or whether it gets paid out the personal money?
I think in general, the palace agrees these things with the Treasury. There are Treasury guidelines, and indeed these payoffs. I think that on the taxpayer accounts, the palace paid £444,000 in redundancy payments and exit packages in the last financial year, and those had been agreed with the Treasury.
Interesting. Okay. Well, that's all the latest on the finance news. As I said, we could talk about that for a long time.
Yeah.
It's interesting. Things to come from that. But whilst we are slightly on the topic of Frogmore Cottage and talking about all of these residences, something which I did think which might have popped up into the decision of Prince Andrew leaving there in maybe going to Frogmore Cottage. Obviously, Sarah Ferguson lives there too. And this week she did reveal about her breast cancer diagnosis. Yes. Evidently, extremely stressful time for anybody to go through cancer treatment, and moving is also extremely stressful. So do you think that perhaps has tied into moving as well, Richard?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very difficult to see them moving in the current circumstances. They clearly don't want to move anyway. So,
and that just ties into it.
Yeah, but I think what is worth saying about Sarah is, and I used to see her quite regularly, and getting. I think when Beatrice and Eugenie, before they were at university and while they were at university, and their futures hadn't been sorted, she was quite keen to introduce them to the press. And then when they decided that they didn't want to be working royals, they wanted to go off and have their own careers and whatever, then that sort of dried up a little bit. So it's a while since, and for whatever reason, but what I want to say about her is that, in some ways she has been a nightmare for the royal family. She has, been at the heart of several scandals down the decades, financial scandals, whatever. But at the root of it, she is a lovely person, and her enthusiasm is infectious. I've seen her motivating people like Teenage Cancer Trust events, and she, I think, deserves a lot of praise for the way she dealt with what must have been a devastating diagnosis. In going public and in using her, she's had a single mastectomy, and in using that to urge other people to go out and get checked, and using the publicity to try to help other people. And I think she's...
Yeah, I mean, she was spoken about on Good Morning Britain, which she has been interviewed for, and Susanna Reid, who's also got a big following, who hosts Good Morning Britain now, said that she'd be putting off her scan for ages, and it made her want to go. So yes, I agree. How else will the royal family be supporting her through this time? I'm not sure if she's still close even with the king. She used to be very close with Diana. I'm guessing it's not really quite the same with Camilla. Is there any other ways that they'll be supporting her?
I'm sure as a family, there's always a distinction between what they do as a business, if you like, and what they do as a family. And I'm sure the family will have been offering support. And certainly, as far as we understand it, Beatrice and Eugenie and their husbands have been offering support and been around for some of the time at least. So she's now, as I understand it, she's been advised that she probably needs about 5 or 6 weeks to recuperate from the operation.
Huge operation. Do you know if that was NHS or private, Richard?
No, it was private. She was diagnosed on the NHS at the Royal Free Hospital. I mean, I think she had an initial scan, and then a mammogram, and then a much more detailed one. And certainly the detailed one was at the Royal Free Hospital in Hampstead in northwest London. And on her podcast, she couldn't praise the NHS enough. But she does seem to have had the operation at the King Edward VII's Hospital in Marylebone, central London, which is a private hospital that the royal family uses a lot.
Right. Okay. Thank you for telling all that detail, Richard. And the topic which lots of you have been wanting us to speak about today is Prince William launching his homewards homelessness initiative, and he has been travelling across the UK, and it has raised questions, which we did briefly touch on last week, about, given his privilege, given just what you've been saying, Richard, about how many homes the royal family do have at their disposal. Is it a little bit rich that Prince William is talking about homelessness, given the privileged position that he's in? But his argument would be, well, he's got this platform and he's shining a light on it. But this has been an issue which has been in the UK for many, many years. So what makes his campaign different, Richard?
Well, yes. I mean, I think first thing to say is, yes, it is difficult for him, I think, because he and his family own so many homes, and it's just it's an easy argument, isn't it, to make that, well, if they just gave up some of their homes and if there was a bit less inequality in the UK, we could deal with some of these problems. But essentially what his spokesman has said about that is that he could let out one of his houses, or he could do something else that might be deemed a PR gesture, but he just thinks that would be a bit cheap, and he actually wants to deal with the root cause of homelessness and to end it for good as far as he possibly can. And so he is trying to. Some of these themes will be familiar to people who follow the royal family. It's all about using royal convening powers, and I think some of the journalists covering this have asked similarly to you, well, what's new about this? What can he do that others haven't done, and why hasn't it been done?
Sloane said William is using his royal privilege to the benefit of others. I'm all here for it. So there you go. There's some positive.
Yeah. But the idea is he because of his status, he's able to bang heads together, bring people together, and try to change the underlying approach to homelessness in this country. And well, it's going to be interesting to see how it goes. He's already highlighted some examples of how it can be tackled. I think what he's also trying to do is to change people's perception of who is a homeless person, and that's quite interesting. Because certainly palace officials said to us before this was launched that if we asked people in this room how would you describe a homeless person, you'd think about the the guy sitting outside the tube station with out begging for money. And in fact, a lot of homelessness is
sofa surfing.
It's not that. I mean, he went down to. I'm trying to think which place it was.
It was in London, I think.
Yeah, he started off in London, but in one of the places he went to. It was in Newport in South Wales. He met a couple of women who'd been homeless and who are now being housed in sort of prefabricated housing there, new development. And so one of them, she got divorced. She broke up with her husband. She got divorced. She was living with one of her daughters, and then she didn't really go into detail, but that didn't work out for whatever reason. And then she was sort of sofa surfing around friends' houses. And then before you know it, she was living in a shed for 4 months. And these are not the stereotypes, I don't think, of homelessness that people think of. I certainly spoke to people. I went over to Belfast, and I was talking to a young woman who had been homeless since her teens. Again, she didn't go into too many details, and I didn't pry, but she just said she had family issues, so she ended up in hostels. And so what he's doing is doing what the royal family often do, which is shining it's a bit of a cliche, shining a spotlight on the issue, but also trying to bring people together to solve a problem that has perhaps widely been regarded as unsolvable.
And this is a solo project. You know, we've seen Catherine being out and doing her own thing for various different projects this week, but this is purely solo. Why is that?
It's his thing. I mean, it's been his thing. He's perpetuating his mother's legacy. I mean, he sees it as his destiny to try to fulfill her legacy, which was to combat homelessness. She introduced him to. She took him to a homeless shelter for the first time when he was 11. I think it deeply moved him, and so he's looking at examples in like countries in Finland where they've adopted, what they call a homes first policy. So essentially find somebody a permanent home and then deal with the other issues that might have led to homelessness in the first place, which, in some cases could be addiction or it could be family breakdown or other.
Yeah, and whatever it might be. And obviously we've seen ambassadors like Jerry Halliwell there, who's obviously been helping with the campaign. Does he or does his team choose who the ambassadors are?
Yes, they'll choose. What I do want to say is he, rather like Kate with her early years campaign, he's flirting, with political issues. So there's some danger there, and he'll be keen not to get too deeply involved in party politics. But the people around him who are partners in the coalitions in the 6 areas where he's setting up this scheme are all essentially saying that there isn't enough social housing being built, and that only central government, local government, can do that. So it is going to put pressure on government, like one way or another, to change, to essentially move away from the idea that the market can solve everything, and so we have to build more social housing.
Absolutely. As Sloane said, as a couple, they reflect mental health and every patronage without the preaching. Well, there we go. Yeah. I mean, I suppose, homelessness, of course, one of the effects of homelessness would be a damage to your mental health, obviously. So, yeah, quite right. But you said at the beginning of this topic, Richard, that obviously he thinks it's cheap. To give away any of his homes to homeless.
A cheap PR shot, yes.
To confirm, he wouldn't be doing that. He's not going to help at all, even on a private level.
Well, what he has said is that he would like to build social housing on the Duchy of Cornwall's land. So he's inherited that, that 130,000 acre property empire, owns land across several counties in England, and he's exploring the idea of building social housing, but there are no details as yet. And he's been thinking about this for a couple of years, but no concrete plans as yet.
And any private donations towards the project at all? Because I know when you said to me previously, Richard, when they go to all of these different charities and such, there is an undisclosed sum which they can put towards it.
Yeah, well, what he's done is through the Royal Foundation put £3 million in.
Yeah,
I'm saying that's his own money. Most of that money will have come from wealthy donors.
But it's still a significant amount.
Yes, and clearly £3 million isn't going to solve Britain's homelessness problem. We've got about 300,000 homeless people.
Yeah,
he's going to take billions to solve.
And of course, with the cost of living, it's just unfortunately going to get worse at the moment.
Yeah, so this is just seed finance for these 6 local groups. They've all got £500,000 each to set up work, studies. Local action plans. It's a bit of seed money, really.
Yeah. Okay. I think we did a poll on this, so we'll bring up the poll if we can. Do you think do you think Prince William's new campaign will genuinely help the issues surrounding homelessness in the UK. No, 59%, yes, 40%. Now, I did actually expect the poll to actually be a bit more significant in terms of the no there. So some people do have faith in his campaign. So I guess that's quite positive. But as you said, there's so much to be done.
Yeah. I mean, the problem for the royal family is that they can bang heads together, as I said, but they don't hold the purse strings for the country to deal with these problems. So we've seen something similar with the mental health work that William, Kate, and Harry did, which has unlocked huge demand for mental health services that the government needs to meet.
And of course, as you just said, that touching quite difficult lines when you get politics involved.
We did. I mean, I did. Conscious of the time, but they can get things done still, though. And while I was in Belfast, Prince William was out doing a walkabout at the end of the meeting, and mentioned to somebody in the crowd, the Reverend who'd been showing him around, Reverend Brian Anderson, had been telling him stories about his grandfather, and he smiled about it. So I went back in and asked the Reverend Anderson what he'd been saying, and he'd been telling Prince William about the time in 2008 when the Queen and Prince Philip went to that East Belfast mission and looked at plans for the building that William was actually visiting earlier this week. And the Queen asked, well, why hasn't it been built yet? And was told, it's down to money, ma'am, that we haven't got the money for it yet. And Prince Philip turned round to the assembled politicians and civil servants and said, why don't you just give them the beeping money? It began with a B, and within 3 weeks, apparently, the politicians and civil servants had found the money to get the building.
Well, there you go. With a little bit of pressure, lots of people did say that he, at times he was inappropriate, but perhaps a little bit of bluntness does help. Okay, then. Well, we are running out of time on the Royal Roundup, so we're going to have to wrap it up there, I'm afraid. But to get more in-depth analysis of all of the royal finance news today, have a look at Richard's Twitter at Royal Reporter. I'm sure there'll be lots more in the paper as well. And of course, online, where you'll get an array of different stories too. We will be doing all of our exclusive Royal Roundup lines over on Instagram at Daily Express, and of course on our stories as well on Twitter too, and you can catch our playlists over on YouTube. So there you go, that's enough plugs from me. Richard, thank you very much. I am off next week, so we will do an extra special Royal Roundup when I am back in a week or so. That's also news to Richard too. Yes, we'll be back in a couple of weeks, where I'm sure there'll be lots more to go over by that point, with 2 weeks worth of Royal Roundup news. Richard, thank you for coming on. And we will catch you in a couple of weeks.